Warhammer 40,000 Crusade. Armageddon. The Red Angel's Gate. Space Wars. Grimnar's Great Company. It was Njal Stormcaller who heard the call. Whilst in secluded contemplation, the High Rune Priest of the Space Wars had received a vivid vision. A lupine spectre had stalked into his waking dreams, imparting in his mind a vision of a world on fire, its continents drowning in blood. As the spirit fixed him with a red-eyed gaze, it growled an urgent phrase that continued to echo through the recesses of Njal's mind hours after leaving his seclusion. Doom comes for Armageddon. The Space Wars had been engaged in annihilation cults of the Orks in the outer reaches of the Armageddon sector when the High Rune Priest received his revelation. The warriors of Logan Grimnar's Great Company, the champions of Fenris, were spread across a front spanning 4 star systems. Neither were they alone. Elements of the Blackmanes, Bloodmoors, and Deathwolves were also present, attempting to contain the resurgent Orcs and prevent southward incursions towards the vital Armageddon system. Logan Grimnar was left with a difficult choice to make. He could disregard Njal Stormcaller's vision and trust that others would deal with whatever looming threat approached, or he could trust in his High Rune Priest's wisdom, potentially allowing the Orcs to begin their offensives anew. Such was the urgency and insistence with which Njal delivered his counsel that Grimnar was swayed. The loss of Armageddon would spell disaster for an entire sector. He had learned over centuries to trust the insights of his old counselor, and knew that he could not risk such a catastrophe from coming to pass. And so, the Great Wolf called in his banners, withdrawing all the warriors and materiel he could spare from active war zones to his flagship, the battle barge, All-Father's Honor. He set course for the Armageddon system. The Space Wolves reached Armageddon to find its defenders mired amid heretic uprisings and civil strife. The Voxmaster of the All-Father's Honor received prioritized requests for aid from Hive governors, Astra Militarum officers, and scattered Space Marine strike forces. Unable to respond to every such cry for help, Grimnar identified the weakest points in the Imperial defenses and dispatched his warrior packs accordingly. The bulk of his forces landed on Armageddon Prime. Thunderhawk gunships departed their hangar bays, accompanied by armored-laden landers and streams of drop pods. The Space Wars had come to Armageddon. Black Templars. The Second Armageddon Crusade. Logan Grimnar was not alone in acting upon a vision. However, that which impelled High Marshal Helbrecht was experienced firsthand in a blaze of golden glory. When it came, he had been crushing Orcs and Tyranids of the Octarius sector. As he knelt at his devotions, a towering figure, its features obscured by a halo of radiance, manifested before him. The figure placed a burning hand upon his shoulder. At the visitor's touch, images of profane desecration flashed through his mind. He saw gore-slicked pyramids rising over ashen wastes. He saw cities crumble and burn. He saw brothers die in their droves, and blood rain from the heavens. As horrors unfolded before him, he realized that he knew the setting of this nightmare scene. Armageddon. The vision faded. Helbrecht took a deep, gasping breath and opened his eyes. The figure had gone, leaving nothing more than the warmth of its touch upon the pauldron of his armor. Indomitable though his faith was, the High Marshal knew well enough not to trust such a vision blindly. And so, aboard his flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship Eternal Crusader, he convened a gathering of his most trusted sword brothers. The debate lasted for many hours. Some of Helbrecht's brethren claiming the apparition to be a message from the God Emperor, others counselling caution and surmising that chaos-tainted witchery may be responsible. In the end, the High Marshal resolved to trust his faith. He had felt no deception or sensed that reviled stench of witchcraft. If the vision had been Emperor sent, ignoring such a call would be nothing short of heresy. At his command, the Eternal Crusader's engines flared to life once more, and its complement of warriors girded themselves for a new crusade. Emerging in the war-scarred Armageddon system, the battleship was greeted by a blistering barrage of Vox transmissions and Auspex readings. Communications with other Imperial forces soon revealed that the Black Templars were not alone in reinforcing the embattled world. A sizable force from the Space Wolves was also present. Their battle barge, All-Father's Honor, hung in orbit over Armageddon Prime. The contrails and engine flares of the Space Wolves' dropships were visible as they headed towards the surface. Appraising the situation, Helbrecht set his sights upon the beleaguered hives of Armageddon Secundus. He could coordinate with the Space Wolves and other local Imperial defenders later. Now was the time for action. War without end. Armageddon. Armageddon, one of the most crucial worlds in the Segmentum Solar, has been blighted by pollution, riven by Orc invasions, and plagued by continual bloody warfare. Yet despite the reduction of its once prodigious production capacity, Armageddon remains a linchpin system at the center of several key warp routes. Its loss would be a devastating blow to the Emperor's creaking realm. Armageddon's heavily scarred and polluted surface is divided into 3 primary land masses. Most of the planet's population dwells on a single continent, confined within a series of teeming hives that protect from the planet's sweltering and polluted atmosphere. The successive invasions of Orc warlord Ghazkhul Thraka have seen several of the world's hives reduced to ruin or overrun and temporarily occupied by rampaging Orcs, the majority of whom now lurk in the planet's thick and sweltering equatorial jungle. While evidence of the Orc invasions is abundant, the lingering traces of the First War for Armageddon are far less noticeable. This conflict saw Angron invade the planet at the head of a large Khornate army. Millions were slain before the combined efforts of Logan Grimnar and the Grey Knights resulted in Angron being struck back and banished. Though centuries have passed since the demon primarch's first onslaught, reminders of the war remain. The most prominent is an obsidian monolith located deep within the equatorial jungle. Though it appears on no official map, rumors abound of unwary patrols encountering the cursed monument, only to fall victim to murderous insanity. That Imperial authorities routinely seek to suppress the spread of such rumors only serves to fuel further superstition. The northern continent of Armageddon is known as the Fire Wastes. The high temperature here make most of the landmass uninhabitable for humans, with only the coastal regions capable of supporting laborers unprotected by envirosuits. At the heart of the Fire Wastes is the Red Angel's Gate. This seething warp anomaly lies at the convergence of a series of empiric ley lines, hairline cracks in the substance of reality that run through Armageddon's crust and have been widened by the opening of the Great Rift. Roaming bands of demons spill from the Red Angel's Gate, and dozens of regiments stationed in this region have fallen into the embrace of Khorne. The relatively meager Imperial forces stationed at the continent's fringes are all but destroyed in the aftermath of its opening, leaving only scattered bands of survivors to fall prey to roving demon packs. Transmissions, Intelligence, Inquiry Ref 8916-666 / AMDN. Conquest of Armageddon. Ghazkhul's invasions. the Orc warlord Ghazkhul undertakes consecutive invasions of Armageddon. The first sees the planet brought to the brink of ruin, mainly due to the heretical incompetence of its planetary governor, Overlord Hermann von Straub. It is only thanks to the efforts of the insubordinate Commissar Yarrick and the intervention of the Adeptus Astartes that disaster is averted. Armageddon has scarcely had time to recover before Ghazkhul strikes again at the head of an even larger invasion force. Hades' hive is obliterated during the fighting, and many of the planet's hives suffer severe damage. The successive conflicts result in billions of deaths, and while Ghazkhul eventually abandons the war, the Orc presence is never eliminated from Armageddon's surface. Pursuing Ghazkhul. While fighting continues on Armageddon, Ghazkhul's absence allows the Imperial military to restore a measure of control. Overrun hives are liberated, and most of the Orcs are driven back to the equatorial jungle or to Hive Tempestus, the only hive remaining in Orc control. With the situation under relative control, Commissar Yarrick leaves the planet, taking a proportion of its military strength with him, and joins High Marshal Helbrecht's Black Templars in their pursuit of the Orc warlord. Noctis Aeterna. The opening of the Great Rift spells disaster for worlds beyond count, and Armageddon is not spared. Warp storms ravage the system, engulfing its worlds in mutating energies and spilling tides of demons onto the surface of Armageddon. The warp storms leave their most lasting mark in the Fire Wastes, the northernmost continent of Armageddon. The sudden influx of warp energies that swamps Armageddon ignites lingering traces of empiric corruption buried in the planet's crust. In the heart of the Fire Wastes, a fault line cracks open, spilling forth corrupting energies that mutate the surrounding environs and permanently weaken the veil between reality and the warp in this location. This slowly expanding anomaly will later become known as the Red Angel's Gate. The Blood Crusades. The coming of the Great Rift is a gift to the followers of the Blood God. As Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade cuts through the Imperium, World Eaters, Khornate demons, and masses of cultists pour out of the warp. The Khornate hordes spill from the Cicatrix Maledictum in 8 directions, riding raging warp storms. Catching many systems off guard, these Blood Crusades inflict widespread carnage. One Blood Crusade carves a path towards Armageddon, only to break apart as it crashes into the Orc-held territories of Golgotha. Though the Blood Crusade's momentum is broken, its remnants continue to pose a threat across the Armageddon sector. The fall of Hive Thoradus. The influx of demons and warp energies sees new conflicts emerge across Armageddon. Battles erupt across the planet, the majority occurring around the Fire Wastes ore mines and prison complexes. In the eastern reaches of Armageddon Secundus, Hive Thoradus is assaulted by a combined force of heretics, Chaos Space Marines, demons, and traitor titans. The defenders of Hive Thoradus hold the line with great bravery, but are eventually driven back into the bowels of the beleaguered hive. Colonel Burkant of the 473rd Armageddon Steel Legion eventually takes the measures of sabotaging Thoradus's power cores. The resultant catastrophic explosions bring the superstructure down upon the invaders and deny the survivors their prize. A beacon for butchery. The death and destruction caused during the siege of Thoradus feeds the Red Angel's Gate, causing it to swell. The expanding warp scar acts as an empiric beacon, a pulsing sore of hatred and fury, whose throbbing sends waves of corrupting force rippling through the warp. Light years distant from Armageddon, Angron's former flagship, Conqueror, heeds the call. Its engines abruptly flare to life, and the vessel plunges into the warp without warning. Khornate demons and the ships of World Eater warbands and other renegades are dragged along in its wake. Titan's Foresight. The threat of the Great Rift stretches the resources of the demon-hunting Grey Knights to breaking point. Entire brotherhoods are decimated or cut off from each other by warp storms, and those that remain cannot hope to counter every demonic threat arrayed against the Imperium. Within the chapter's fortress monastery on Titan, the Prognosticar diviners sift through the warp, their psychic senses searching for the telltale disturbances in the fabric of reality that herald demonic manifestation. The empiric tremors radiating from Armageddon draw their attention, yet this is not all they see. Something is tearing through the sea of souls, leaving a rippling wake like an aquatic super predator. They recognize the fell spore of the entity at once. Angron comes for Armageddon. A call for aid. With time critical, the Prognosticars turn to their pool of recondite arcana, enacting diabolic rituals and incantations inscribed upon wooden relics known as the Elucid Stellae. They project the spirit of one of their number into the warp and make direct contact with Grand Master Hrothgar Morvans of the Fifth Brotherhood. Communicating in spectral form with the Grand Master, the Prognosticars advise him to alter course from the Nachmund Gauntlet and instead guide the Fifth Brotherhood to Armageddon. The Prognosticars also dispatch astropathic warnings to others. Visions are seeded into the minds of High Marshal Helbrecht and Jarl Stormcaller, couched as spiritual revelations to hide the sorcery with which they are crafted. These undertakings cost the lives of 3 Prognosticars, whose minds and souls are burnt out by their efforts to sustain the ritual. Of the Elucid Stellae, nothing remains but wisps of foul-smelling smoke. The Ensanguined. Within the highs of Armageddon, a new wave of cult activity rises. Many of the lowest and most desperate inhabitants dedicate themselves to Khorne, engaging in wanton slaughter. Loyalist citizens are purged, as the zealous agents of the Adeptus Ministorum seek to root out the rebels. Their efforts do little to stop the spreading violence. As the Highs struggle to contain the tide of heresy, corruption spread south from the Red Angel's Gate, lapping at the northern reaches of Armageddon Secundus. Near the ruins of Hive Thoradus, no fewer than 4 regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion turn their weapons upon their erstwhile allies. Cultist mobs emerge from the depths of the shattered hive to join the assault. Within days, the traitors occupy the Hive's ruins. The few heretics captured for interrogation speak of a prophet of the blood god, a leader who calls herself Ascara the Ensanguined. Convergence. Logan Grimnar's Space Wolves and High Marshal Helbrecht's Black Templars arrive at Armageddon to find the planet riven by war. Grimnar's warriors land in the vicinity of High Fleet Volcanus in Armageddon Prime. They engage teeming masses of mutant abominations from the High's lower levels. Wolf Scout kill teams venture into the depths, targeting cult leaders and destroying weapon caches. Though the fighting continues, the intervention of Grimnar's forces buys time for Volcanus' officials to restore order amongst its defense regiments. With Grimnar's Space Wolves already deployed to Armageddon Prime, Helbrecht dispatches his battle brothers to Armageddon Secundus. Helbrecht joins Imperial forces near Hive Infernus and makes a concerted effort to push back the heretic armies besieging the Hive. His ultimate objective is to recapture the ruins of Hades and Thoradus and purge them of their rebel occupiers. With the aid of the Krieg 74th Line Corps, advances are made and new trench lines and fortifications dug. The Fifth Brotherhood. Grand Master Morven's Fifth Brotherhood arrives in orbit of Armageddon and appraises the grim situation. He and his battle brothers swiftly identify loci of warp energy scattered across the fire wastes and dispatch interceptor squads to investigate with impunity. The rest of the Preserver's strength is held in reserve as Morvens considers his next move. The Eaters of Worlds. The unexpected arrival in orbit of the Conqueror and its attendant fleet produces ripples that reach Armageddon's surface. Whilst the combined might of the Eternal Crusader, All-Father's honor, and remaining Navis Imperialis squadrons ensure Imperial naval superiority, the World Eaters and their allies show little interest in engaging in protracted void combat. Instead, the Chaos Fleet surges into low orbit. Expendable Khornate warships are hurled towards the Imperial fleet, serving as a screening force whose sheer aggression ties up the Imperial fleet just long enough for combat drops to be achieved. Warlords of Armageddon. Hrothgar Morven's, Grand Master of the Fifth. The foresight of the prognosticars had forewarned Grand Master Morven's with knowledge of Angron's approach. Still, it was only after arriving on Armageddon that he understood the scale of the Red Angel's Gate. The occult augurs of the Grey Knight's vessel detected great torrents of empiric energy spilling from the fire wastes. Upon teleporting onto Armageddon's surface, the Grey Knights found the fire wastes mutated by the warp. Skull-faced volcanic mountains vomited forth rivers of molten brass and bubbling gore. Fortresses of blackened iron loomed out of the cratered lands, their spiked ramparts laden with the impaled remains of human victims. As a Grand Master of the Grey Knights, Hrothgar Morven's knew more of Armageddon's past than anyone in the system. He knew, for instance, of Angron's first invasion and the empiric faults left in the wake of the demon primarch's banishing. He knew, too, that the key to closing the Red Angel's Gate lay somewhere in Armageddon's tainted crust. He resolved to find it. Styrbjorn Flint-Eye, Grimnar's Chosen. A trusted veteran of Logan Grimnar's Wolfguard, Styrbjorn Flint-Eye has served as a battle leader in dozens of conflicts, most recently the campaign against the Orcs of Golgotha. When the champions of Fenris arrived upon Armageddon, Grimnar found the defense of High Volcanus and Armageddon Prime as a whole in disarray. Thus, as Grimnar took command of Imperial forces, Styrbjorn and a detachment of Battle Brothers were dispatched with orders to reach Armageddon Secundus. There they would link up with Helbrecht's Black Templars, aiding their fellow Space Marines in a combined assault upon the heretic strongholds in the ruins of Hades and Thoradus. Though Styrbjorn's reputation is that of a savage warrior, he possesses a code of honor as strict and unwavering as the Great Wolf's. Whilst corruption runs rampant across Armageddon, Styrbjorn believes that Armageddon and its populace can be saved. This belief has proven a bone of contention with the Black Templars, at whose side he was sent to fight. Castellan Halser, Helbrecht's left fist. Castellan Halser despises traitors with the same vehemence as he does the alien and the witch. His orders from Helbrecht are to rally the Imperial defenders of Armageddon Secundus and lead offensives on the traitor-held positions of Thoradus and Hades. He knows, however, that before any such offensive can be successful, the front lines must be stabilized. Thus, Halser and his Crusader squads have established a new defense position, the Imperator line, between the heretic stronghold of Thoradus and the still vulnerable Infernus and Acheron. If a massed heretic assault comes, it will break against his newly fortified Imperator line and meet the formidable combined firepower of Black Templars and Astra Militarum regiments. When the traitors have been put to flight, Halser intends to strike swiftly, pursuing the foe back to the hole from whence they crawled. Then his warriors will purify Hades and Thoradus via their tried, tested and preferred method, the prodigious application of holy fire. Angron, Demon Primarch of the World Eaters. The opening of the Great Rift empowered many warp-spawned beings, but few more than Angron. His bloody forays into reality saw billions slain. Consumed as he was by his rampages, the tearing open of the Red Angel's Gate barely registered in what was left of the demon primarch's mind. Yet, as uprisings rippled through the planet's hives, and cultists erected gore-encrusted idols, chanted prayers, and undertook ritual sacrifice, the gate's pulsing energies grew, registering even above the pounding of the butcher's nails. They acted as a beacon in the swirling madness of the warp, drawing the demon primarch ever closer. However, the arrival of the Space Wolves and Black Templars upon the planet, and the bloodshed that have followed, drew the Red Angel inexorably towards Armageddon. Gruesome portents would herald Angron's arrival. The waters of the Hemlock River turned blood red, and crimson rain fell in torrents to drown soldiers in their foxholes. The Red Angel's gate quivered and pulsed as the demon primarch's manifestation loomed. Jarok Skreel, disciple of the Red Angel. Lord Jarok Skreel was present on the bridge of the Conqueror when the void ship's demonic machine spirit growled into life, igniting its engines without warning and plunging into the warp. Skreel and his exalted Eightbound stood watch over Conqueror's bridge, slaughtering any world-eaters who sought to alter the vessel's course. Each of them hosted within their hulking bodies demons of Khorne, and their possessors had also felt the call of the Red Angel's gate. The Conqueror and its accompanying fleet emerged in the Armageddon system and bludgeoned into orbit above the primary world. The heaving fleshy masses of what were once crew servitors throbbed and twitched amidst webs of cables and glistening gristle. Hollow displays of Hive-World Armageddon flashed across filth-encrusted vid screens. Skreel felt the restless fury of his possessor as his mind raced, selecting drop sites and objectives for his warriors to seize. Angron was coming. He would earn the demon primarch's favor by spilling blood beyond measure. Askara the Ensanguined, Cult Firebrand. Of all the heretic leaders and rebel demagogues to have risen from the bowels of Armageddon's hives, none have amassed a following approaching that of Askara the Ensanguined. She had been serving amongst the Armageddon Orc hunters when she stumbled across Angron's monolith, a stone-wrought legacy of the demon primarch's first bloody invasion. She had been a pitiless killer even before the encounter. Whatever experience she endured in the shadow of that cursed place, it only served to stoke her murderlust. Askara's goals are far loftier than mere wanton butchery. She claims to be a prophet of the Red Angel, has communed with warp entities, and journeyed north to bathe in the malefic radiance of the fire wastes. Many blood cultists have flocked to her banner. From her base in the ruins of Hive Thoradus, she has directed followers across Armageddon's continents to construct monolithic icons to Angron. These, she claims, will draw the Red Angel to Armageddon. Then, she promises, the bloodshed will be glorious indeed. Armageddon Prime. After Logan Grimnar's Thunderhawk gunship alighted on the landing pads of Hive Volcanus, the Great Wolf emerged to find the highest defenders stretched thin. Having spent long years preparing to fight an all-out war against the external threat of an Orc invasion, the defenders were ill-equipped for an internecine battle against cult insurgents. Assassination and attrition had eroded the highest experienced military units and commanders, leaving only inexperienced militias as a defense. Grimnar took command of the Hive, merging decimated units and dispatching his packs to crush resistance within Hive Volcanus and secure the tactically significant plains of Unthrand. Control of this expanse of ash waste, located to the south of Hive Volcanus, would be crucial to prevent aggressors, be they Orc or heretic, from seizing key passes through the Volcanus mountains and outflanking the Hive's defenders. The arrival of the World Eaters opened a third front. Waves of goremonger and jackal cultists, driven forward by berserkers, landed across the northern reaches of Armageddon Prime. These landings forced the Great Wolf to withdraw several regiments from the plains of Unthrad in preparation for an expected assault on the Hive's eastern perimeter. Stretched thinly, The defenders of High Volcanus would soon find their lines bowing before the World Eaters' relentless onslaught. Armageddon Secundus. Larger and far more populous than the primary continent, Armageddon Secundus has long been the planet's administrative and industrial heart. All of its hives suffered extensive damage during the Orc invasions, with Hades' hive completely obliterated in the open exchanges of Ghazkhul's second invasion, and Hive Tartarus' population reduced by 75% in the fighting. By the time Helbrecht's Black Templars had landed to the north and west of Hive Infernus, heretic forces had begun to reverse significant gains made by Armageddon's Steel Legion regiments in the wake of Thoradus' destruction. These heretical blood cults reoccupied the ruins of Thoradus and Hades and swayed many Astra Militarum units to their cause. With the heretics possessing heavy armor, artillery, and even aerial assets, any attempt to advance across the ash wastes was met with ferocious combined arms counter-assaults. The arrival of the World Eaters' fleet, brought to Helbrecht's attention by the bridge crew of the Eternal Crusader, saw clawed heretic drop pods fall like rain over Hive Hades. The High Marshal was forced to divide his crusaders. He took half his warriors north to seize the Eumendes Bridge, the primary crossing over the Eumendes River's sludgy torrent. This fortified structure overlooked scrub and marshland, south of Hive Hades' ruins. The battle for the bridge saw the first direct clash between the Black Templars and World Eaters. The remainder of Helbrecht's forces were placed under command of Castellan Holzer and ordered to assist in the purge of Hive Thoradus' ruins. They would fight alongside the Krieg 74th Line Corps and several dozen other infantry, artillery, and armoured regiments. The Season of Blood. The twisted mass of Hive Thoradus' remnants rose from the wastes of Armageddon Secundus to dominate the cratered expanse for miles around. Ascara the Ensanguined stood on the parapet of a captured trench line, the city at her back. Gripping her chainsword tightly, she ran her tongue over lipless teeth and gums, eagerly awaiting the inevitable violence to come. Cowled masses of cultists flocked around her. Some wore little more than tattered rags and stained overalls, clutching makeshift weaponry encrusted in gore. Others were clad in Hive Militia's blood-stained and desecrated uniforms, or Astra Militarum regimental fatigues. All were coated in the blood, gore, and filth of months of fighting. Beyond the trench line, networks of squat bunkers, coiled wire, and hastily dug trenches crisscrossed the rubble-strewn approach to the Hive's ruined interior. The shells of burned-out armored vehicles lay scattered around its perimeter, and to the west lay the wreckage of a toppled Reaver Titan. A lake of radioactive fuel and leaked coolant pooled beneath its colossal mass. "Hail the Red Angel, bringer of blood, breaker of chains!" Ascara screamed over the din of gunfire. Before them, the first wave of attackers waded through the toppled Titan's spilt lifeblood. Most were clad in long coats of dull grey, their features obscured by rebreathers, the lenses of which glowed eerily as they advanced. Ascara's cultists unleashed volleys of autogun fire into the mass of soldiers. Wisps of crimson drifted across the shimmering surface of the toxic mire. Ascara sucked a lungful of air through her gritted teeth and raised her weapon. With a guttural howl, she pointed the chain blade towards the advancing soldiers and signaled the charge. A chorus of wild screams erupted around her as hundreds of crazed cultists scrambled over the lips of trenches and hurled themselves at the advancing soldiers. Volleys of lasgun fire cut through the cultist throngs. Ascara felt a bolt tear into the flesh of her right arm. The pain barely registered above the pounding of her own heart. The cultists smashed into the advancing soldiers before they could fire a second volley. Chain blades, clubs, auto pistols, and makeshift blades were pitted against the enemy's bayonets. Ascara lost herself in the violence, bringing her chainsword sweeping across the flak-armoured gut of a wounded foe. Her victim fell backwards, lasgun falling to the ground as they clutched their ragged wound, trying desperately to prevent their entrails from spilling onto the ground. The momentum of the cultist charge carried them splashing through the coolant lakes under the fallen Titan and on, down towards the opposing trench lines. Askara hacked and bludgeoned any foes caught in her path. The gargles and screams of the wounded and dying mingled with the booming explosions of incoming mortar rounds and the crack of lasgun fire. Cowled cultists tumbled bonelessly down the scree slope, twitching as the life fled their bodies. The skies above were aflame. Angular dropships screamed through ashen clouds, leaving dark contrails in their wake. Drop pods fell like fragments of a shattered asteroid, the fires of an atmospheric entry licking from their plated hulls. Some were plucked from the sky by streaking missiles. Most plunged through hails of flak to slam into Armageddon's toxic earth. Askara bludgeoned, skewered, and butchered her way forward. She felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. A shiver ran through her spine, and her skin tingled. Across the front line, amid the slaughter, the fabric of reality began to slew away. Kicking another soldier aside, she brought her chainsword down on top of his head. Shards of bone and wet brain matter splattered across her body. Above Askara, unreality wailed like blood from a laceration, the silver cut swiftly expanding into a ragged wound, through which a colossal winged figure tore, sweeping down before the charging cultists. A torrential afterbirth of blood and viscera fell with it, flooding trenches and sweeping stunned soldiers to their deaths. The demonic figure flexed his wings and gazed down upon the cowering combatants below. Cable implants spilt from his skull, writhing like a nest of metallic snakes. He raised his colossal blades and let out a roar of pain and fury that set Askara's soul ablaze. Then he thundered forwards on iron hooves, trampling cultists and loyalist soldiers before soaring into the burning sky. Tracers illuminated his diabolic form, and flak fire splashed harmlessly from his brass armor. The red monster roared, a primal bellow of apoplectic rage that sent waves of fear through trembling bodies. Askara felt her muscles flex and swell. A red mist fell across her vision as she hacked through stunned opponents. The Red Angel had heard the call. The season of blood had dawned. Armageddon ablaze. The descent of the World Eaters upon Armageddon had thrown the ongoing Imperial offensives into chaotic disorder. As the blood flowed, so did the warp spill into reality, bringing a demonic nemesis of unparalleled savagery. With the remainder of the World Eaters' fleet now positioned in low orbit above Armageddon, the invasion could truly begin. Bulk landers, drop pods, and landing craft of varying sizes and patterns drove through the skies, accompanied by packs of winged demon engines that fought aerial duels with Imperial fighters. For every landing vessel that spiraled to the surface engulfed in flames, dozens more made landfall and disgorged their deadly cargoes. The majority of the invaders landed in the northern reaches of Armageddon Secundus. There they fortified the ruins of Hive Hades and Thoradus, erecting grotesque monuments to the blood god. These malefic idols, wrought from twisted metal, red stone, and the remains of sacrificial victims, were redolent with warp energies, and served to empower and extend the demonic energies coursing across the planet from the warp scar at its northern pole. In Armageddon Prime, Logan Gremnar of the Space Wars had taken command of disorganized Imperial forces riven by treachery and internal conflict, and set about putting down the active rebellions festering within the bowels of High Volcanus, and organizing defensive troops in and around the Volcanus Mountains. Meanwhile, in Armageddon Secundus, High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars had established his base of operations in Hive Infernus, the current seat of Armageddon's government, and a metropolis in the grip of civil strife. From this hive, his Black Templars were already engaged in campaigns to the south and east, seeking to recover and purge the ruins of Hades and Thoradus, which had fallen into traitor hands long before Conqueror's arrival in low orbit. Thoradus bleeds. The push towards Hades' hive had ground to a stalemate around the Eumendes Bridge. Here mobs of Khorne worshipping cultists and well-equipped traitor guard regiments had stubbornly resisted a grinding Astra Militarum advance. The deadlock was broken when the World Eater's landing vessel smashed down onto the colossal structure, unleashing packs of berserkers. The relatively narrow span of the Eumendes Bridge impeded swift maneuver, preventing the Loyalist defenders from bringing much of their heavier firepower to bear on the newcomers. Trapped between the entrenched heretic forces on the far side of the bridge and the rampaging berserkers to the rear, the Imperial defenders were swiftly hacked to pieces. Only the intervention of Helbrecht's Crusader squads, aided by the prodigious firepower and might of dreadnought brother Gunthar, prevented a complete rout. While this battle saw thousands killed and the Loyalists driven back to the relative safety of Hive Infernus, it would be in the vicinity of the ruined Hive Thoradus that the pivotal fighting of the conflict's opening phase would unfold. Castellan Holzer of the Black Templars oversaw the Imperial push towards the ruins of Hive Thoradus with the assistance of Colonel Korps, commander of the Krieg 74th Line Corps. It had initially met with great success. Colonel Korps' council had restrained Castellan Holzer's ingrained preference for aggressive strategies. Korps feared that, should a direct assault upon the traitor's position fail, the path may be opened for a swift counterattack across favorable terrain, potentially leaving Hive Acheron at risk. Thus it was decided that, before engaging the traitors, a series of defensive positions should be established. In this manner, any heretic counterattacks could be broken before they gathered any momentum. This was a task to which Korps' combat engineers were well suited. Construction began with Imperator Line Alphas, a formidable line of bunkers, gun nests and artillery emplacements stretching miles across the ash waste to the southwest of Hive Thoradus. As the Death Corps soldiers completed their construction work, Holzer's Black Templars led repeated forays into the heretic lines. Holzer and Korps' offensive pressed the dissenters back towards Thoradus' shattered mass. Korps' experience in trench warfare saw the Loyalists utilize repeated artillery bombardment and swift trench raids to goad the enemy into ill-advised assaults. These disorganized and ill-disciplined attacks were beaten back by the overlapping fire of heavy weapons teams and concentrated attacks under the Black Templars and supported by heavy armor. Once seized, ground was fortified, with each advance adding a new layer of defense. Imperator lines Veyron, Iota, Mortis. These were a handful of those dug, fortified and reinforced as the offensive ground forwards. Eventually, however, progress slowed. As the attackers closed in on Hive Thoradus' ruins, they inevitably ran into heavier defenses, and the more disciplined heretic troops stationed in the southern and western fringes of the broken hive proved far less susceptible to Korps' baiting tactics. By the time Conqueror's massive bulk appeared in orbit, the offensive had become a static conflict between opposing trench lines. The descent of the World Eaters and their masses of cultists removed any hope of the Loyalists capturing their objective. Bolstered by teeming hordes of jackals and packs of berserkers, the heretics were resurgent, pushing back the combined Imperial army with repeated attacks. With each violent death inflicted, the swell of empiric energy battering the fabric of reality increased in intensity. When the barriers of real space could contain it no more, the warp spilled forth in a gushing tide of demonic fury. It was by this route that Angron stormed onto the surface of Armageddon once again. Already hard-pressed, the Imperial forces fighting in the vicinity of Thoradus were caught flat-footed by the Red Angel's manifestation. He plummeted from blood-red skies and swept through successive waves of Death Corps infantry. Tides of demons followed in his wake, bursting into reality behind Imperator lines mortis. Slavering fiends mounted atop brazen steeds thundered through glowing rifts to smash into the exposed flanks of armoured vehicles. At Imperator line primus, the foremost defensive position, canine monstrosities bound into loyalist trench lines, ripping and tearing until their spike frills and moors were coated in viscera. Bloodletters loped forward to hack off the heads of stunned soldiers and take them as macabre trophies. In the hours that followed Angron's manifestation, Halsar and Korps' armies were driven back across the ground they had spent days seizing. First fell Imperator line primus, followed swiftly by Mortis, Iota, and Veyron. The bodies of Astra Militarum soldiers and heretics littered each seeded trench line and blasted expanse of no man's land. Everywhere Angron struck, the line bowed again, threatening to collapse entirely and clear the way for a heretic assault on Acheron. The survivors briefly rallied at Imperator line Veyron, repelling a concentrated assault consisting of berserkers and tides of mutant cultists. By this time, Halsar and Korps were all that remained of the combined army's senior command structure, and the fighting strength of the units under their command had been depleted by almost half. Angrily, Halsar signalled a general retreat to Imperator line Alphys. As the last Krieg soldiers fled their positions and heretics scrambled over ramparts and barricades, Korps called down artillery strikes and orbital bombardments on vacated positions. He hoped that the resulting conflagration would buy enough time for the survivors to beat an orderly retreat to the last and most formidable line of defence. The defence of Volcanus. Of the many threats to hold Volcanus by orcs and traitors, the most prominent came from the south. There the Volcanus Fourth Army, the majority of which had been drawn from Steel Legion, Vostroyan Firstborn, and Orsani Void Sharks regiments, was mobilized throughout the plains of Anthrand. The primary reason for stationing forces on the plains of Anthrand had been to prevent enemy forces from breaking through the lightly defended foothills south of the Volcanus mountain range and reaching the Mannheim Gap, one of the few navigable passes through the Volcanus mountains. These regiments, battle-hardened by years-long campaigns scouring the Mannheim Gap and Volcanus mountains of Orks, were forced into action once more when World Eater's landing craft slammed down on the western fringes of the equatorial jungle, far from the gun batteries of High Volcanus. There they unloaded their contingents of frenzied cultists, demon engines, armoured vehicles, and warriors from the Forsworn and Brazen Butcher's warbands. Several weeks before the assault, fully half of the Volcanus Fourth Army had been extracted from their positions at the eastern fringe of the plains and redeployed north of High Volcanus to deal with renewed orc pressure from Hive Tempostora and the equatorial jungle. With the remaining troops unable to cover the northern and eastern plains, a decision was made to pull the remaining defenders back, closer to the Volcanus mountains. 3 layers of defence were retained. The 2 outer layers of defence, the Orientum and Meridium lines, faced east and south, respectively. Both were lightly defended and positioned less than 100 miles from the Volcanus mountains. Given the lack of orc incursions in the recent years, the defenders were ill prepared to repel a heavy assault. The third and most formidable defensive position, the Volcanine Wall, had been positioned to block any attempt to bypass the mountains and reach the Mannheim Gap beyond, and was situated within range of powerful ordnance built into the eastern-facing slopes of the Volcanus mountains. When the attack came, the remnants of the Volcanus Fourth Army had only partially completed its westward withdrawal. Khornate assailants capitalized upon the loyalist disorder and lack of heavy firepower, utilizing armored transports to overrun and destroy straggling units before they could reach their assigned lines. Attacks on the Orientum and Meridium lines followed, whilst a smattering of heavy weapons positions at the front line accounted for some of the heretic transports. Dozens smashed through tank traps and minefields to disgorge their cargo of ravening cult warriors. Emboldened by combat stims and sheer unbridled fury, the traitors recklessly launched themselves on their enemies. The Meridian line held for several days, the Loyalists managing to push back wave after wave of cultists and traitors. Resistance came to an end when the Orientum line crumbled beneath the ferocity of the Khornate onslaught. Trench lines, pillboxes, and command bunkers falling one by one, and leaving each surrounded by piles of ruined corpses. This allowed the heretic assailants to push south, striking the Meridian line from the flank and rear. With their positions now untenable, the retreating Loyalists formed makeshift battle groups. They struck west, attempting a breakout that saw most of their armor and heavy equipment abandoned to the enemy. Relief came from an unexpected quarter. The World Eater's arrival and the orbital battles that accompanied it had not escaped the notice of the Orcs of the equatorial jungle. Determined not to miss out on the escalating violence, the battle-hungry Xenos surged out of their mech workshops and scrap cities and struck west. The first wave of Orcs, led by the customized vehicles of speed freaks, engaged the rearmost heretic units in running battles. In the following days, the Beast-Snaga tribes of the Purungai Basin stumbled out of the equatorial jungle and thundered to join the fighting. The threat posed by the Orcs drew traitor units away from the Vulcine Wall, bleeding their strength long enough for the Meridian and Orientum line survivors to reach the volcanic wall. As news of the onslaught reached Logan Grimnar, he dispatched what reinforcements he could spare to bolster the defense of the Vulcine Wall. Sweeping over the Volcanus mountains, a trio of Space Wolves dropships plummeted to land amidst the Imperial defenses and deployed Bloodclaws and Grey Hunter squads. With the Khornate assault slowed by the Orc advance, Grimnar's warriors could launch several successful counterattacks that drove the enemy east. The shattered remains of the Orientum and Meridian lines became the sites of brutal three-way struggles between Loyalist regiments of the Astra Militarum, the World Eaters, and the rampaging forces of myriad petty Orc warlords. After 3 bloody days of vicious fighting, the Grey Wolf received word from Field Marshal Ghazkhul of the Volcanus 4th Army, confirming that the situation, while still somewhat precarious, had been stabilized. The Mannheim Gap would hold, at least for now. Meanwhile, within High Volcanus, the Great Wolf scout packs continued to root out and destroy the Khornate cult cells hidden in the highest bowels. To the north, the World Eaters, having landed in large numbers, pressed towards Volcanus. Demonic hordes came forth at their side. The bloodthirster Zulkor, leading tides of bloodletters and blood crushers in repeated assaults on the outer defenses. The demons' attacks were only halted when Logan Grimnar and his Wolf Guard launched cavalry assaults that cut through the engaged Zulkor directly. The fighting was savage. Thunderwolf cavalry crashing headlong into blood crusher counterparts. The Great Wolf joined the fight, engaged in a bloody duel with the Zulkor that ended with the Axe Morkai buried in the demon's horned skull. With the bloodthirster's demise, Volcanus' northern perimeter was secure. Defeat at Hades' Hive. Angron's manifestation at Thoradus struck a devastating blow to Loyalist efforts to seize the Hive's ruins. It also served to draw many heretics towards the Red Angel's rampage. Taking advantage of thinning enemy numbers near Hades' Hive, the High Marshal and his sword brothers led a second assault on the Eumenides Bridge, intending to exploit resultant gaps in the foe's lines. This time, they were aided by a pair of titans from the Legio Crucius. The warlord titans Cataphractus Pugnus and Irae Ferrum supported his attack, leveling the heretic positions with devastating missile salvos and obliterating cultists with Gatling blasters. Beneath the lumbering titans, the chimera transports of the Armageddon Steel Legion ground their way across the corpse-laden bridge, over endless coils of barbed wire and into the traitors' defensive positions, where they deployed chem-masked soldiers to seize ground. Helbeck's crusaders lent aid wherever the advance faltered, burning out stubborn foes with their pyre blasters and meeting the furious charges of berserkers with their own brand of zealous rage. Several hours of bitter fighting later, the last of the traitors were driven from the Eumenides Bridge. However, the Loyalists' push towards Hades' Hive would soon be impeded, just as in the vicinity of Thoradus, blood-spilling shattered reality, allowing infernal entities to tear their way into the fray. Demons emerged from the storm-racked skies and plummeted into the Imperial lines. The demons were not alone. World Eater's bulk landers plunged from the heavens to land across the breadth of the colossal crater that had once been Hades' Hive. From the bellies of these monstrous landers strode a trio of Chaos Titans, their castle bulks adorned with profane iconography and bristling with warp-corrupted weaponry. The monstrous war engines lumbered forward, unleashing apocalyptic volleys towards their loyalist counterparts. Ire Ferrum bore the brunt of the onslaught, void shields flickering and collapsing under the terrifying onslaught. Barrage's corrupted missiles exploded against the Titan's hull, crackling streams of warp energy burning their way through armor and cabling. With Ire Ferrum crippled, Cataphractus Pugnus was forced to turn its attention to protect its stricken ally. Elbert and his Crusaders charged forwards, braving the Titan's duel to engage demonic foot soldiers beneath. The High Marshal's blade wove a silver tapestry of destruction, taking the heads from dozens of demons. The clustered ranks of Astra Militarum soldiers that formed the majority of his forces, however, were decimated by the Titan's fire. Amid this bloodshed, Styrbjorn Flintai and his Space Wars battle brothers announced their arrival, their storm wolves alighting atop one of the traitor Titans. Cutting their way inside the Chaos Titan's armored shell, the Space Wolves fought their way through its crew and bands of berserkers to plant melter charges on the monster's tainted reactor, before fighting their way free of the doomed Titan. The subsequent detonation of the war machine's volatile core tore the heart out of the heretic force, consuming mortal cultists in atomic fire and casting demonic entities back into the warp. The victory, however, was short-lived. The losses suffered by Helbrecht's armies were so significant as to prevent them from continuing their advance. Instead, the battered survivors withdrew towards the relative safety of Hive Infernus to regroup, rearm, and plan their next offensive. The Khornate Murder Tide. Prior to his return to Armageddon, Angron resolved to ensure that, this time, his onslaught would not be seized by mortal hands. The passage of time meant little to an empiric being like him, and the stinging memory of his prior defeat remained raw. Thus, at his command, demonic agents had impelled mortal thralls to construct several pyramidal monoliths across the nightmarish expanse of the fire wastes. These structures, positioned on 8 ley lines running from the Red Angel's Gate, served to channel the rampant energies of the warp through Armageddon's strata. Such structures would also be raised in the ruins of Thoradus and Hades. Thus, as Angron's invasion began, blood flowed, and lives were snuffed out. So would those unholy constructs drink deeply of the combatants' anger, channeling resonant emotional energy into the warp rift and expanding the aura of unreality that followed in Angron's wake. It fell to the commanders of various World Eater warbands to marshal the Heretic Alliance, and none were more prominent than the slaughter-bound Jarok Skriel. The butcher's nails pounded incessantly in Skriel's mind, joining his greater demon possessor in demanding blood. Yet Skriel retained enough clarity of thought to deploy his forces with the tactical precision of any Space Marine commander. At his order, a corps of cultists and renegades were deployed to the fire wastes to occupy positions long ago abandoned by their loyalist defenders, and further fortify the demonic bastions surrounding the Red Angel's Gate. Goremonger packs were dispatched to the frigid Deadlands at Armageddon's southern pole. They would strike at aqua processing plants, denying the plants' besieged hives purified water. On the coastal islands surrounding the fire wastes, traitor Astartes Militarum regiments seized prison complexes and oil refineries, providing an influx of recruits and further straining the local Imperial war machine. These targeted strikes had the secondary effect of drawing Imperial forces away from the northern reaches of Armageddon Secundus, where the main thrust of the World Eaters had been focused. Skriel's Eightbound exploited the chaos to their advantage, traversing the warp to thrust themselves into the heaviest fighting and reap a terrible tally of skulls. The Preservers. Rather than intervening directly in the main battles against the World Eaters and subversive cults, Grandmaster Morvans and his Fifth Brotherhood exploited the bloody turmoil, dividing their forces to achieve a range of esoteric objectives. In the equatorial jungle, Librarian Lovrik followed the Red Angel's psychic spore. He and his battle brothers fought through the feral Orc populations to reach Angron's primary monolith. A trio of battle brothers anointing the structure with the blood of sacrificed gnolls, whilst Librarian Lovrik chanted the invocations of purification. As the ritual concluded, the trees erupted into life, frenzied chaos spawn and enraged mutants emerging from the foliage to throw themselves upon the Grey Knights. All met their ends at the edge of Nemesis blades. The cleansing of the monolith cut loose but one of the empiric strands binding the Red Angel's essence to Armageddon, yet many more remained to be severed if the world were to be rescued from the brink of ruin. Meanwhile, Taurus Hendron, brother captain of the Fifth Brotherhood, devised methods of destroying Angron's physical form. He led Percation squads in an assault on the ruins of the Diabolus Forge complex. This sprawling mass of destroyed manufactorums stretched across the Diablo Mountains east of Hive Infernus. Deep beneath its remains, so the archives of Titan claimed, lay a cache of weapons. These relics from the dark age of technology had long been sealed away by the agents of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and knowledge of their existence had become lost even to the most learned of Martian adepts. Destroying the scattered Orc mobs that made their homes within, Hendron's strike force battled its way to the heart of the destroyed forge complex, locating beneath the rubble a subterranean labyrinth of lightless passages concealed by layered shroud shields. At the center of this maze, they found the vault that they sought and, disabling its stasis fields, forced entry. Within, they uncovered rack after rack of black-capped warheads. The devices were vortex missiles, weapons capable of tearing apart the fabric of reality and plunging all caught in their blasts into the raging tides of the warp. With extreme caution, the warheads were removed from their missiles and secured for the next stage in Hendron's strategy. As his battle brothers completed their assigned missions, Morvans led his band of warriors into the burning expanse of the fire wastes. There he set himself to locating, and where possible, sundering profane beacons and monuments erected in Angron's name. Other Grey Knight strike teams were dispatched to Hades and Thoradus, infiltrating those heretic strongholds to slay cult demagogues and tear down warp-infused idols. These efforts served to slow the spread of corruption. If a true victory were to be achieved, the Grey Knights would need to request broader aid and draw Armageddon's other Imperial forces into esoteric war against the unreal. The Purging of Infernus. By the time Helbrecht's battered forces had completed their retreat to Hive Infernus, following their failed assault on the ruins of Hades' Hive, the skies over Armageddon's northern hemisphere glowed an ominous red. The air fizzed with static as empiric and atmospheric storm fronts clashed. Imperator-line alphas held, for now, but the situation remained dire. The violence that had been unleashed was a blazing lure to the demonic. Mortal anger, fear, and pain had opened fresh rents in real space through which the blood god's legions tore their way into reality and slaughtered Armageddon's defenders. Many of Infernus's defenders had been drafted to join the High Marshal's offensive, significantly contributing to a breakdown in law and order within the Hive. To Helbrecht's disgust, Khornate cultists had overrun Infernus Quay, smearing their profane symbols across dockyards and grounded vessels and stringing the leering skulls of their victims from loading cranes and gantries. Half of the Savlar regiments stationed around the Infernus South Forge complex had turned upon their former allies, stoking the fires of a bloody urban conflict that had drawn defensive units away from the Stygian bulwark. This, in turn, threatened to allow the resurgent Orcs of the Palidus Mountains to swarm the walls and break into the forges. To Helbrecht, whose ire had already been raised by defeat, such blasphemy against a god emperor was unforgivable. In his eyes, the embattled district populations were beyond salvation. Rallying his crusaders, he began a brutal purge of Infernus's outer districts. No distinction was made between friend and foe. Those districts that had fallen to the heretics and rebels were scoured of all life. Confronting the Red Angel. Though millions had been slain, the deaths of traitors and heretics served only to increase the tideswell of warp energy battering Armageddon. Hive Infernus and Acheron were on the brink of falling. Now, Grandmaster Morven's knew was the time to reveal the Grey Knight's presence to their beleaguered allies and to enlist their aid in the final stages of his plan. Morven's issued communiques to a handful of Imperial commanders, including Logan Grimnar, High Marshal Helbrecht, a smattering of inquisitorial agents, and Princeps Matthias Kalanice of the Legio Crucius. In the command sanctum of the Grey Knight's battle barge, Bright Sword, the hololithic avatars of the embattled commanders appeared before him. Most looked upon him with consternation. Only Logan Grimnar betrayed a spark of recognition, for he alone had fought at the side of the Grey Knights and lived to possess the memory. Morvens addressed the hastily summoned council, speaking of the gravity of their situation. He proclaimed that if the Red Angel's gate could not be sealed, then the war could not be turned in their favor. Doing so would be no small task. It would require, Morvens explained, the assistance of all those he had gathered. In the following discussions, the simmering contempt between Grimnar and Helbrecht threatened to bubble over, the two exchanging barbs and accusing one another of derelictions of honor and duty. The Grand Master silenced their arguments with a raised fist. Such disagreements were counterproductive, he stated. Only by pooling their efforts and remaining united could the Loyalists achieve victory. Morvens continued, unveiling his plans. The primary threat to Armageddon was not, as some had argued, Angron himself, but the open warp wound at the heart of the fire wastes. The priority remained sealing this portal, a task for which their Grey Knights were suited. To facilitate this, the Grandmaster explained, Angron would have to remain distracted and, if possible, be banished. It was clear to all that the Imperator line would only hold the Red Angel briefly, yet perhaps its advance could be turned in the Imperium's favor. In the Diablo Mountains, Brother Captain Tauros Hendron and his warriors had cleared the Diabolos Forge complex of Orks. The sprawling structure stood in a formidable defensive position atop the range's highest peaks, the perfect site for which to stage a defense. If the forces holding the Imperator line were to undertake a staged withdrawal westward, drawing Angron's army forward skirmish by skirmish, then perhaps the traitors could be lured into a costly battle in mountainous terrain that favored the defenders. It was decided that Logan Grimnar and High Marshal Helbrecht would lead complements of their warriors to bolster the defense. This would buy time for a second force to strike north, crossing the boiling sea, and begin an offensive towards the Red Angel's gate. Morvens, ably assisted by Princeps Kalanice, Castellan Halzer, Colonel Kors, and Grimnar's deputy, Styrbjorn Flinteye, would lead the second offensive. Though the tension between Grimnar and Helbrecht remained palpable, the assembled leaders acceded to Morven's strategy, and the enormous logistical task of maneuvering Armageddon's armies began. The Diablo Mountains. Helbrecht and Grimnar's Space Marines arrived at the destroyed Diabolos Forge complex almost simultaneously. Battle brothers of both chapters coordinated with the platoons flooding in from Hive Infernus to prepare defenses. Catachan reconnaissance regiments deployed in the foothills below laid minefields and prepared ambushes. Sentinels traversed mountainous terrain to reach forward vantage points. Communications were established with the aerodromes of Hive Infernus, enabling the defenders to call for aerial support. Hendron's Grey Knights withdrew to the shattered heart of the Forge complex, taking with them tech marines and adepts of the Adeptus Mechanicus. There they sought to access the hidden subterranean levels of the ruin, seeing to their own esoteric preparation for the Red Angel's onslaught. As planned, the retreat from the Imperator line was a staggered affair. To keep the traitors engaged, sacrificial counterattacks and rearguard actions were fought at every stage, drawing the enemy on. By the fifth day, more than half of the retreating soldiers were out of action, butchered by the oncoming traitor army or dead from sheer exhaustion. This sacrifice, however, had the intended effect. When the last retreating loyalist entered the Diablo Mountains foothills, Angron's army's vanguard elements were mere miles behind them. As planned, loyalist artillery channeled the pursuing Khornate hordes into valleys already zeroed. As the traitors entered these killing zones, spotters concealed upon the mountaintops gave fire orders. Thunderous barrages tore through the advancing Khornate armies. Avalanches spilt down the mountain slopes, burying heretics beneath tons of jagged stone. Still, the mass of augmented cultists and wild-eyed mutants surged forward, those at the rear clambering over the corpses of their fallen to fall upon straggling loyalists. Though direct, the World Eater's advance was not without its own strategy. Angron knew a trap when he saw one. By his order, Goremonger packs scaled the sheer mountains to the west and north, terrain the loyalist defenders considered impassable, and struck the rearmost Imperial fortifications. Many lost their grip and plummeted to their death. Those that survived were joined by packs of Eightborn, who burst from the Immaterium in showers of gore into gun pits and bunkers, slaughtering rear echelon squads and forcing front-line defenders to turn their attention away from the Khornate advance. With the aid of winged demon princes and airborne demon engines, most loyalist artillery was soon suppressed. Angron's forces were able to grind their way relentlessly towards the ruined forges, whilst the narrow and debris-choked mountain passes rendered any assault by tracked armor impossible. Ambulatory demon engines faced no such difficulties. Snarling mechanical monstrosities scaled loose scree and sheer cliff faces to tear open breaches in the Forge Complex's walls. Grimnar and Helbrecht kept most of their warriors in reserve, drawing the enemy further up the slopes and through prepared kill zones. The Great Wolf had positioned his force to cover the eastern approach, supporting lightly armed penal battalions, and miasman red cowls dug in around the base of the complex. This formidable position afforded his Long Fangs broad fields of fire, overlooking the slopes and valley below. Helbrecht and his crusaders, their strength enhanced by the presence of 3 dreadnoughts, oversaw the southern defences. Here the inclines were not as steep, but they were strewn with boulders and loose scrub that provided advancing cultists and world eaters with greater cover. Even so, the first waves of Khornate cultists were felled long before they reached the line. Following assaults were impeded by the corpses blocking their path. Only when the momentum of the traitors' assault slowed did Angron descend to battle. Plummeting from the skies to land amidst the rubble of the eastern walls, he lashed out with his blades, splitting open Helbrecht's dreadnoughts and cutting down Black Templars by the dozen. As the violence increased, the demon primarch seemed to swell with power. Helbrecht's Black Templars were forced back from their positions on and beneath the walls by the intensity of the onslaught. There they were joined by Logan Grimnar and his surviving Space Wars, and together undertook a fighting withdrawal, moving back through the ruins of the Diablos Forge complex. As Angron's followers unleashed their fury upon the entrenched defenders, the demon primarch pursued the retreating Space Marines. He smashed his way through barricades and half-destroyed walls, outpacing his own embattled warriors in his fury. The demon primarch eventually found himself in the gutted remnants of a grim-slicked furnace littered with discarded orcoid detritus and corroded machinery. His burning gaze fell upon Taurus Hendron. The brother captain and his bodyguard stood before him. On the floor, traced in powdered silver and bone, was a unicursal hexagram. At each of its 6 points stood one of the conical vortex warheads recovered by Hendron from the complex's subterranean vaults. As Hendron intoned words of banishment, the Grey Knights opened fire with storm bolters and psi weapons. The impact of these projectiles upon Angron's body stoked his fury further. He rushed forward, hateful and dismissive of his opponent's pathetic sorcery, proving the inconsequential nature of their occult symbols by smashing his way through them. The wards surrounding the circle, the most powerful Hendron could conjure, saw wisps of steam rise from Angron's body, searing and burning his flesh as he stepped fully inside. As he did so, Hendron reached for a detonator and thumped the trigger. The binding circle had not been drawn, as Angron had suspected, to ensnare him. Its purpose, instead, had been to contain most of the fury of the detonating warheads. Within a bubble of shimmering energy, rampant empiric forces tore the demon primarch's form asunder, before collapsing with a thunderous crack. As the force field of psychically charged energies crumbled, a deafening rumble echoed through the forge complex's bowels. Quakes rippled through the mountains, as abyssal shafts split slopes and swallowed loyalists and heretics alike. Thousands were buried beneath the collapsing mountains. Angron had been temporarily banished, but the price for such success had been terrible. The few loyalists fortunate enough to escape the apocalyptic destruction dragged themselves back towards the relative safety of Hive Infernus. The outcome of the conflict now hinged upon their allies' hopeful success in the fire wastes. Assault on the fire wastes. Striking back. The battles raging in Armageddon Prime and Secundus drew the attention of most of the world's defenders, yet the conflict in the corrupted Badlands and mutated desert expanses of the fire wastes determined its fate. Long before the World Eater's invasion, the loyalist forces stationed in the coastal regions of the fire wastes had borne the brunt of the demonic incursion upon Armageddon. They had been subjected to repeated attacks by infernal manifestations that clawed as violently at minds as they did at flesh. Many were driven mad or submitted to the whispering promises of fiendish beings turning upon their allies. The disastrous situation was soon exacerbated by a lack of supply from beleaguered hives in the grip of uprisings, resulting in many defensive positions abandoned entirely to the blood god's worshippers. Defensive lines constructed to contain Ghazkhul's Orc hordes now lay in the clutches of heretics and demons. Before attention could be turned to sealing the Red Angel's gate, Grandmaster Morvans and his loyalist forces would need to land on the southern shores of the fire wastes and clear the traitors from their positions. The Grandmaster now had an army of considerable might at his disposal, composed of more than 24 Astra Militarum regiments of varying strength and speciality. Foremost amongst these military assets were the remnants of Colonel Kors's 74th Line Corps, reconstituted following the Battle of the Imperator Line, and well-versed in fighting in inimical conditions similar to those that they would experience. Conditions in the fire waste were notoriously deadly, with temperatures high enough to scorch unprotected flesh, rampant radiation, industrial pollution, and toxic storms. According to distorted readings from orbiting Space Marine vessels, the fluctuating warp phenomena pulsing from the Red Angel's Gate added a new layer of lethality to the continent's environment. Even the Death Corps' ability to fight on in the face of terrible conditions will be tested in the battles to come. Carving a beachhead. Conveying such a large force across the treacherous boiling sea was arduous and logistically complex. Though the orbital battle had by this stage turned in favor of the Navis Imperialis and Space Marine fleet, traitor aircraft remained a constant threat, and few air defenses could be spared. Thus, most Astra Militarum soldiers, armor, and materiel were to cross the tempestuous oceans on various mercantile craft, military landers, and requisitioned ocean-going vessels. Some departed from the Volcanus archipelago, making the treacherous journey through those island chains. Others boarded at Yarrick's Hope, a harbour far to the east, one of the few districts to have escaped absolute annihilation when asteroids leveled Hades' hive. The Space Marines under Holzer and Flintheye mustered at Phoenix Island, located no more than a few miles from the shores of the Fire Wastes. Here, Holzer's Black Templars set about purging scattered traitor forces and re-establishing control over the Victorinus starport. Mainly seized intact, this facility would serve as a resupply and rearming station for the coming assault, enabling Imperial assets to fight close air support for ground troops, dropping aid to frontline units, and redeploy reinforcements into the fight as and when required. The first landings in the Fire Wastes were to be made to the south of the Chearanas mines. Morven's Grey Knights struck ahead of the main force, inserting a teleport strike and Storm Raven gunship to engage the enemy and drive well-equipped and determined units of traitor infantry from their positions overlooking the shores. Flintheye's Wolf Scouts infiltrated bunker networks and destroyed stubber nests and gun batteries. Thus, when the assault ramps of the first landers dropped, the emerging Imperial troops were met only with a smattering of mortar rounds and small arms fire. Reaching the interior. With Loyalist forces still making landfall on the coastline, the first waves of Death Corps infantry routed the remaining coastal defenders and pressed north. Ahead of them lay the Chearanas ore works, a colossal network of strip mines and deep shafts, towering chimney stacks and worker hab blocks, beyond which lay the rather more formidable defences of the Ranas fortified region. Initially constructed to contain rampaging Orks within the interior of the Fire Wastes, this network of defences was now occupied by traitor units, including elements of the Arphista Penal Legions, the Hadean Hounds, and Ascara, the Ensanguine's cult of Crimson Deliverance. Resistance within the Chearanas ore mines proved heavy. Packs of cultists and mutants emerged from mine shafts and caverns to ambush Loyalist infantry as they moved north. World Eaters, fighter craft, and Helldrakes hunted the skies, descending to strafe infantry caught in the open. Demon packs ripped their way into reality to expand the exposed flanks of infantry columns, and traitor artillery fire whistled overhead while detonating in their midst. The environs themselves brought their own danger. Howling, irradiating sandstorms swept from further inland, causing rad sickness amongst the advancing soldiers. Empiric hallucinations afflicted the advancing columns, and the ground itself churned and shifted, opening chasms that separated units and swallowed tanks whole. Inch by inch, the Death Corps troops pushed on. Black Templars and Space Wolves launched targeted attacks on enemy strongpoints, while Morven's Grey Knights destroyed demonic assailants wherever they appeared. With heavier Loyalist assets landing to the south, artillery pieces and armoured vehicles moved forward to clear heretic survivors. After 2 days of bitter fighting, the Loyalists had moved within 10 miles of the Iron Line. At dawn of the third day, the breakthrough assault began. Ascara the Ensanguined had withdrawn from Thoradus to oversee the defence of the areas north of Chearanas. There she had established, through no small measure of violence, a loose alliance of cultists, murderers and turncoat soldiers equipped with purloined enviro gear to protect them. The traitors were also supported by the Legio Vulpa Banelord Titan, Tardum Moors, and 2 smaller Reaver Titans of the Legio Vulpa, all of which had lumbered south from the vicinity of the Red Angel's Gate to take up firing positions behind the line. The first wave of Imperial attackers struck after a punishing preparatory barrage intended to soften the traitor defences. Instead, they found their advance halted by the Titans' fire. Gouts of boiling blood vaporized Loyalist soldiers, and armoured transports were trampled beneath titanic armoured feet or swept aside by gigantic demonic weapons. Even the notoriously determined warriors of the Death Corps threatened to break beneath the terrifying onslaught. Spurred on by the destruction, the defenders lost what little discipline they possessed, charging into the wavering Death Corps soldiers with reckless fury, and suffering terrible casualties of their own. Amidst the carnage manifested Khorne's demons, drawn by the increased violence to sate their bloodlust. The rival of Loyalist Titans from the Legio Crucius saw the conflict turn in the Loyalists' favour. Wading out of boiling sea came the freshly repaired warlord titans Irae Ferrum and Cataphractus Pugnus. Great columns of steam boiled from their gigantic forms, clumps of desiccated aquatic vegetation falling from their bodies as they strode forward to engage their corrupt cousins. Volleys of fire from the two Loyalist titans struck their enemies, toppling the Reaver and forcing Tarda Moors to retreat north towards the Red Angel's Gate, finally enabling the Loyalists to overrun the traitor positions. The Red Angel's Gate. Spread out across the fire waste and beyond, moulded by the hands of Angron's devotees, and each positioned in areas saturated with empiric energy, rose towering monoliths to the Red Angel's might. These mark sites of forgotten battles, brutal slaughters, and other places cursed by Angron's demonic touch. The Grey Knights of the Fifth Brotherhood spent much time pinpointing the locations of the critical monoliths. In Armageddon Prime and Secundus, they shattered several such structures. Their actions drove back the warp storms assailing these heavily populated regions. The far wastes, however, were a different matter. Here empiric anomalies boiled in the heavens above, and the lands bore the scars of boundless corruption. By shattering key monoliths near the Red Angel's Gate, the Grey Knights sought to weaken the bonds that gave the portal permanence. This would enable Grandmaster Morvans to conduct grand banishing ritual, sealing it for good. Two anchoring monoliths would have to be destroyed, both of which lay at crucial junctures on the most prominent ley lines to the southeast and southwest of the Red Angel's Gate. Neither would be easy to reach nor destroy. The occult connections that tied each to Armageddon's crust would need to be broken, a task which only the Grey Knights could perform. This would mean dividing their strength, at least temporarily. The first of the monoliths rose to the southeast of the Crimson Mesa, the flat-topped mountain about whose crown the Red Angel's Gate itself roiled. Castellan Halzer and his remaining sword brothers would lead the attack upon this position. The second stood to the southwest of the portal, amid the black lung tar pits. Sir Bjorn Flint Eye Space Wolves would take responsibility for this assault. Morvans would lead the third and largest force, pressing towards the Crimson Mesa and clearing a path for the final assault. Blood-red skies and rolling storm clouds blotted most of the sunlight, leaving the entire region bathed in a crimson twilight. As if the stifling heat and toxic winds were not enough, the lands around the embattled armies now resembled the pits of an infernal abyss. Needles of brass-capped volcanic rock had erupted from the earth to loom over the landscape. Towering butts topped with brass crenellations and strewn with macabre trophies soared where once the land had been low and pocked with craters. Loyalist soldiers were wilted by the heat, driven insane by the nightmarish horrors they witnessed, or rendered comatose by pockets of enervating radiation. No time could be taken to recover or bury the fallen. The passage of each army was marked by corpses, stripped of their weapons and left to rot where they fell. The Brazen Citadel. The southeastern monolith rose from an expanse of barren land marred by impact craters. A natural occurring rock peak towered from the ground at a sharp angle. The anchoring monolith's tip had been carved to resemble a cornate demon's face, and its features were twisted into an expression of fury. Around the base of the jutting rock rose a tangle of brass-domed buildings and spike-lined ramparts that appeared to have grown out of the earth and lent the structure its moniker, the Brazen Citadel. The monolith was heavily defended. Traitor armor and fortified positions ringed the brass citadel. The blasted wastes of the citadel's south offered the advancing loyalists little cover. Without fire support, Halzer's assault would swiftly grind to a halt. Therefore, he directed 4 platoons of the Sinai Void Sharks, 645th Mechanized Artillery Regiment, to loop east and seize the Deosan Heights, a vantage point the Castellan intended to use as a fire base to support his advance. They were accompanied by Black Templars dreadnought, Brother Clavan. Together, they cleared the traitor guardsman position and enabled the Orsani to set their artillery pieces in position. Talon and Armageddon Steel Legion armoured regiments, meanwhile, circled wide to the west. They sought to cross the Muradip Badlands and outflank their enemies. However, their passage through the Badlands was blocked by the heavy armour of the Gore-Treads warband and squadrons of Leman Russ tanks operated by turncoat Graythan exculpators. The Loyalist transports accelerated towards the objective, dividing into armoured spearheads and plunging into the heretic forces opposing them. The Black Templars led a frontal assault on the Brazen Citadel's southern fortification, using armoured transports to close to within a few hundred yards of the structures. The Loyalist gun positions on the Deosan heights rained fire on the brass ramparts, twisting metal and obliterating fiends and mortal defenders alike. Flights of winged abominations and Helldrake demon engines soared towards the Deosan heights to silence the artillery. Dreadnought Brother Clavan and allied Ursane infantry sacrificed themselves to hold off the demonic onslaught and keep their ordnance firing for as long as possible. As the attackers advanced, the gates of the brass fortress at the monolith's base opened wide, disgorging waves of demons that crashed into the attacking Black Templars. Hal's Space Marines disembarked from their transports to engage in bloody hand-to-hand combat with packs of demons. The attack on the Citadel's perimeter drained the fortress of most of its mortal defenders, enabling Grey Knight squads to teleport into the now weakened fortifications. Reciting litanies of purification, they doused the structure's interior with Titan's holy waters and drove the empiric power from the anchoring monolith. Only then did they cut their way free, calling in orbital strikes to obliterate that which remained. The Gore Beacon. While fighting raged around the Brazen Citadel, Sir Bjorn Flint I took charge of the assault on the southwestern monolith, leading his Space Wolves and detachments of Death Corps infantry to seize the objective. This pyramidal ziggurat was formed of blackened rock and bleached bone, and its face was studded with skulls and leering gargoyles. From the fanged maws of these demonic carvings gushed a noxious, oozing effluent thick with blood, brass, and lumps of indeterminate gore. Scaffolds laden with skulls and grotesque banners rose from its steep flanks, and around its base writhed hideous masses of butchered flesh and stitched sinew. It was little wonder that the anchoring monolith was known to the heretics as the Gore Beacon. It dominated the Black Lung tar pits, a treacherous expanse of anticlinal traps. Warp corruption coursed through the Promethean Sodom bedrock, causing the sticky mass to bubble and spit. Burning gas, toxic fumes, and dark blood-like liquid oozed from the noxious mire. Steer Bjorn Flinty, unable to risk moving heavier assets across the treacherous ground, was forced to assault the Gore Beacon with infantry alone. In the wake of Wolf Scouts and Fenrisian Wolves, whose keen instincts were well suited to locating a route through the bubbling pits, small packs of Space Wolves and Death Corps infantry squads picked their way forward. Some strayed from the path and were sucked into the morass. Others succumbed to toxic fumes, coughing up blood and fragments of their dissolving lungs. As the Imperial attackers crossed the mire, berserkers emerged from the heat haze to match blades with Flint-Eyed Space Wolves and butcher tightly clustered groups of Astra Militarum soldiers. Jarok Skreel and his 8-bound oversaw the counter-assault, aiming to lure the Loyalists deeper into prepared kill zones and striking from warp rifts to ambush their foes. While the fighting to take the Gore Beacon raged on the surface, Grey Knight's gunships roared down through the storm clouds to deploy strike squads onto the step sides of the ziggurat to begin their cleansing rituals. The arrival of the Grey Knights immediately caught the attention of Jarok Skreel and his Viscerati, who abandoned the battle against the Space Wolves and their human allies and ascended to Gore Beacon's flanks in a desperate attempt to prevent the Grey Knights from achieving their goals. Skreel's 8-bound tore through the warp, emerging amongst the Grey Knights and engaging them in a furious fight. Empowered by the empiric energies coursing through the monolith's obsidian mass, Skreel cut his way through the Templars of Titan. The bisecting corpses of silver-clad Space Marines spilt yet more blood on the gore-encrusted ziggurat. Seeing the Grey Knight's plight, Steer Bjorn Flint I and his remaining Wolf Guard fought their way to the gore beacon and through the writhing mass of flesh, entrails, and grasping limbs ringing its base. Ascending the scaffolds rising around the structure, they joined the fight. Flint Eye cleaved a path through the 8-bound to engage Skreel in single combat. Steel clashed and blood flowed. Flint Eye and Skreel's vicious duel unfolded at the heart of the carnage, the two champions inflicting terrible wounds upon one another. Bleeding from a dozen lethal injuries, Flint Eye struck the final blow, burying his axe in the Slaughter Lord's skull. With a cry of anguish, Skreel's body erupted in an explosion of gore and shards of splintered bone, his demonic possessor howling as it was drawn back into the warp. Flint Eye's sacrifice brought the Grey Knights the time required to complete their ritual. The gore beacon's obsidian surface cracked and splintered as empiric forces erupted from within, the surviving Grey Knights vanishing amidst emergency teleportation flares in the instant before a colossal detonation swallowed the surviving Space Wolves and 8-bound alike. As the gore beacon splintered into countless thousands of shards, earthquakes rippled out from the mountain. Atop the Crimson Messer's summit, the storm-wreathed mass of the Red Angel's Gate flickered beneath the blazing glare of Armageddon's star, weakened, yet still unbroken. The battle for the Crimson Messer. As Halder and Flint Eye's forces set about shattering the anchoring monoliths, Grandmaster Morvens led his force to the base of the Crimson Messer. Atop this mountainous plateau blazed the manifest heart of the Red Angel's Gate itself, a crackling tempest of warp energy that cast its malevolent pall over the fire wastes. The empiric disruption surrounding the Crimson Messer was such that attempting to strike by teleportation or dropship would have proven too dangerous even for the Grey Knights. Any such attempt would surely have seen them torn apart, body and soul. Instead, having girded himself with the frame of a Nemesis Dread Knight, Morvens led the massed ranks of Astra Militarum infantry and their engines of war towards the looming mass of the Crimson Messer. Brothers Khorne and Voren, piloting their own Nemesis dreadnoughts, marched at his side. More than 20 of the 5th Brotherhood's elite followed in their wake. Leading the Loyalist advance were multiple divisions of Death Corps armor, tanks of varying patterns and vintage, all bearing the scars of centuries of ceaseless battle. Cowled infantry marched behind the armored hulks, shielding themselves from incoming fire. Interspersed amongst this vanguard were small squads of Space Wolves and Black Templars. Their task would be to support the Death Corps advance, clearing any particularly stubborn resistance. Between the Loyalists and the Crimson Messer, the mutated landscape bristled with ridges of brass and bone. Most of these fortified positions faced Morven's direction of advance, forming successive layers of defense that their traitorous defenders had further reinforced. Turncoat infantry scuttled behind these unnatural defilades, preparing to repel the Loyalist assault. Camo netting was pulled back, revealing the long barrel of artillery pieces and anti-armor ordnance. Weapons teams hauled heavy stubbers, autocannons and other guns into place. Additional sandbag emplacements had been dug behind and atop each ridgeline, allowing the tanks of traitor regiments to take positions that obscured their hulls, leaving only their turrets visible. Firing positions carved from solid rock and prefabricated bunkers bristling with weapons were scattered across the line. Beyond the defensive positions rose the Messer itself. A single scalable route rose from the southern edge of the mountain to reach its flattened peak. Loyalist armor ground forwards, exchanging fire with the traitors. Within seconds of the first shot, the battlefield was thick with smoke. The stench of burning promethium and the spit crackle of ammunition cooking off. Death Corps infantry emerged from behind their steel cover, using the smoke clouds to close upon the traitorous positions. Autogun and stubber fire felled line after line of Death Corps soldiers, yet still they came forward. Charging ahead of their Krieg allies, the Space Marines brought grenade, flamers and melter guns to bear on bunkers, laying melter charges on enemy armor and silencing gun positions with merciless blade work. With each breach, the Loyalists emerged into new fields of fire and were forced to repeat their assaults, losing hundreds of soldiers for each yard gained. Yet eventually, With the last ridgeline cleared of opposition, the Loyalists reached the base of the Crimson Mesa. With the Empiric anchors binding the warp storms to the fire waste sufficiently weakened, all that remained was for the Grey Knights to seal the portal. Vox channels buzzed with activity as Morven's prepared his assault on the Crimson Mesa. Most of the Astra Militarum platoons remained at the base of the Mesa, rallying around Colonel Korps and his command squad, taking cover amidst the rubble to cover the rear. The Space Wolves, Grey Knights and Black Templars led the assault on the slopes, pressing forward under heavy fire to clear snarling cultists from bolt holes and clefts in the rock face. Numerous monstrous and psychotic foes streamed down the Mesa's summit to intercept Morven's force, but the Space Marines' momentum was now unstoppable. The Grey Knights, led by Morven's nemesis Dreadknight, cut a swathe through the demonic hordes streaming from the portal. The Loyalists did not take long to reach the mountain's flattened peak and the furious empiric glare that rose above it, reaching the gate. The Mesa's peak had a diameter of several miles across, most obscured by storm clouds and crackling forks of empiric fire. The red mass of the Red Angel's Gate hung above the center, pulsing like a beating heart. As Morvens, Khorne and Voren drove back the demons with silence of fire and sweeping blows from their nemesis weapons, Librarian Torvik led 8 Grey Knights paladins closer to the gate. Each bore a shard of Angron's shattered black blade in one gauntleted hand. As their Terminator brothers held back the waves of cultists and demons streaming across the Mesa's peak, the paladins held the shards aloft and channeled their psychic might into the forged metal. They chanted sorcerous incantations while tracing fire and blood hexagrams in the air. The 8 fragments of the black blade rose to float before the glowing mass of the gate. Librarian Torvik stood closest to the portal's blazing heart, raising his warding stave aloft as he uttered the syllables of a sealing spell. With the fractured blade fragments acting as an arcane focus, the Grey Knights pooled their psychic might to reverse the flow of the empiric ley lines, drawing Angron's fury out of the planet's crust and back into the heart of the Red Angel's Gate. The mountains shook, tremors rippling from the ley lines and opening chasms in the earth. The gate contracted as if in pained response to the sorcery. Fault lines cracked open in the swirling maelstrom, spilling torrents of blood-stained ectoplasm. Morven swung his nemesis mace into clustered packs of demons, obliterating their forms in balls of azure fire. As he smashed the fiends aside, he felt a bruising pressure forming in the recess of his skull. The gate's contractions continued, increasing in frequency. Something was coming through. Dread Knights at his side, the Grand Master turned towards the looming threat. Even through the warp energy, tearing at his armor suits, latticed wards and clawing at his consciousness, he recognized the demon's spore. Angron had returned. Infectious rage. At the base of the Crimson Mesa, the Loyalist soldiers defending the rear came under renewed assault. Just as at Thoradus, the demon Primarch's manifestation had bolstered the morale of the Khornate army. Ascara, then sanguined, having led her pursuing forces into the fight, rallied flagging traitor guard and fleeing cultists, directing them forward into a hail of defensive fire. Corrupted rhinos sporting the colors of various World Eaters warbands rumbled out of the burning ruins of the brazen citadel, driving forward to grind screaming mortals to matted pulp beneath their treads. From the collapsing gate far above guttered forth echoes of Angron's rage, embers that settled within the minds of loyalists and traitors alike and burst into flaming fury. Disciplined gun lines collapsed as the madness swept through the ranks. Wielding bayonets or swinging las weapons as clubs, Death Corps soldiers abandoned their positions and threw themselves into the Khornate hordes, heedless of Colonel Korps' orders. Regimental commissars struggled to restore order amongst their disordered formations. Korps' command squad became surrounded, the colonel drawing his saber and cutting down several slavering jackals before he fell to a storm of chain blades. He died, still screaming a Krieg prayer of atonement. Pockets of Khornate assailants, led by blood-spattered World Eaters, soon broke through the fractured lines and began ascending the Mesa's slopes, At the summit, Space Wolves and Black Templars moved to repel the assaults, leaving the Grey Knights to contain the Red Angel's fury. Unbinding. Upon the sundering of the Brazen Citadel and the Gore Beacon, the Red Angel's Gate visibly mutated. Its blood pool surface flickered, the storm clouds about crashing together to release booming peals of thunder. The red haze over the Crimson Mesa became weaker and less distinct. Demons twitched and snarled, casting their gaze back towards the portal. To most mortals, such changes were little more perceptible than shifting weather fronts or changing winds. To the Grey Knights, however, the effect was profound. It was as if a pressure valve had been released in their psyches. The corona of warp energy that wreathed the gate's crimson mass, visible only to those with warp gifts, shrunk back. These signs revealed to Grandmaster Morvans that the anchors had been lifted. With this task done, the grand ritual required to seal the portal could begin. Angron emerged from the crimson haze of the Red Angel's Gate, flame licking at the outline of his imposing bulk. Polychromatic wisps of warp energy rose from his skin, and silvered forks of lightning lanced down from the warp storms to illuminate his monstrous form. Thunderous explosions erupted wherever the fulmination struck. Immediately, the demon primarch's gaze took in the Grey Knight, his monstrous face twisting into a snarl of rage as he caught the stench of sorcery. He could feel the accumulating energies of ritual incantations reaching their culmination. He could hear the mortal's whispering mutters, laced with weakness and deceit. 8 paladins knelt in place on the southern side of the rift, their backs to the battle raging across the slopes. Each was deep in concentration, fighting to utter the nightmarish syllables of their grand spell of exorcism. Grey Knight's Terminator stood between the kneeling warriors and the reborn demon Primarch. These battle brothers, too, had pooled their psychic might, projecting a physical barrier around the kneeling paladins that shimmered gold, turning aside incoming fire from advancing heretics. Already, the silver armor was stained with gore, and the ground before them was strewn with the discorporating corpses of fallen demons. Across the Crimson Mesa, Loyalist warriors were engaged in combat with teeming masses of heretics and demons. The thudding report of bolters, the snarl and whine of chainswords, and the crack of lasgun fire conspired to form a deafening orchestra of death and destruction. With a wordless roar of anger, Angron charged forwards, crashing into the Terminators. He lashed out with Spine Grinder. The snarl-toothed chain axe chewed hungrily through the first warrior's latticed wards and ceramite plate, bisecting him at the waist. The ragged halves of the Grey Knight crashing to the ground, hot blood jetting from the dying warrior's ruined body. A tide of diabolic warriors followed the demon Primarch from the portal, tearing their way through the surface of the gate in every direction. Massed ranks of bloodletters loped forwards, profane banners of flensed skin waving in the searing winds, their brazen war horns howling. Bloodcusher cavalry coursed out of the maelstrom to smash into the Terminators. Their arrival emboldened mortal warriors assailing the southern slopes, lending fresh strength and fury to tiring bodies. Grandmaster Rothrin Morvans, having been engaged in heavy fighting atop the southern slopes, noted Angron's arrival. To face the Red Angel's advance, he steered his nemesis Dreadknight through a mass of jackal cultists, swinging his mace through their ranks and pitching broken bodies aside. Bathovoran and Khorne followed suit, aiming their arm-mounted weapons towards a pursuing unit of berserkers. The Dreadknights opened fire, unleashing volleys of azure annihilation from their heavy incinerators and bathing the oncoming World Eaters in torrential gouts of cleansing fire. The flames burned through ceramite, reducing the assailants to molten slurry. Wading through the clawing, slashing torrent of cultists, Grandmaster Morvans swept his nemesis mace from side to side, sundering mortal forms with each mighty swing. Bathagorn skewered a thrashing goremonger upon the tip of his nemesis' greatsword, raising the screeching heretic aloft before casting it into a mass of jackals, knocking several from their feet. Bathovoran turned his Gatling silencer upon a charging blood crusher, Searing beams of psychically charged energy slammed into the brass-armored steed and burned through the demonic rider's chest, pitching both onto the gore-slick stone. Morven's continued forward, dividing his attention between taking in the state of the battle and lashing out at those around him. The paladin still knelt in concentration, even as more demons pushed forward from the gate. His psychic senses revealed their absolute focus upon completing the exorcism ritual. They trusted their outmatched battle brothers to shield them from harm for long enough. Before each of the floating paladins floated a shard of Angron's black blade, Voragth. Each arcane focus was wreathed in power, which formed a shimmering energy field between them. Morven's could feel the pull of the rift upon his psyche as the spell reached its crescendo. The storm above had already begun to retreat, drawn down into the eye of the portal, the gate glutting itself upon its own corruption. The shield conjured by the Fifth Brotherhood's Terminators flickered as Angron butchered his way through them. A half-dozen battle brothers now lay dead in the demon Primarch's wake. The Red Angel's onslaught threatened to foil the Grey Knight's plans. All that mattered now was stopping the demonic beast. "Disengage! Focus your fire on Angron!" Morven's projected the order by psychic impulse to Khorne and Voran. "The casting must be completed." Angron drove Spine Grinder deep into the skull of another Terminator and wrenched it free, pulling with it a stream of steaming blood and brain matter. He strode past the twitching corpse and, with a brutal overhead strike, broke through the faltering psychic shield, driving the teeth of the power axe deep into a paladin's helm and down into the warrior's body. He bellowed in incandescent fury as adamantine-sheathed teeth ground through bone, muscle, and vital organs. A great arc of gore and blood spurted from the dead Space Marine's body, sizzling as it splashed across the scorched rock. A single shard of the black blade clattered to the ground. Angron saw the remaining slivers of blackstone flicker and felt the spell weaken. As he strode towards the next of the kneeling knights, a barrage of azure bolts struck his burnished brass plate and bore into his crimson flesh, releasing gouts of acrid smoke and psychoplasmic gore. The demon Primarch snarled in rage, his malevolent glare falling upon the trio of dread knights. He broke into a loping run, his iron hooves throwing up red dust as he covered the ground towards the Grey Knights. He crashed into the nearest dread knight shoulder first, propelling the warsuit backwards and sending it tumbling across the rocky ground before launching himself high in the air and coming down atop the prone warsuit, bringing Spine Grinder down again. The Dread Knight convulsed violently as its pilot was bifurcated in an eruption of gore and splintered metal. Another of the Dread Knights opened fire at point-blank range, engulfing Angron's body in flame. The demon Primarch roared, charging out of the inferno, and propelled himself at the next of the towering warsuits, launching a flurry of armor-shattering blows. Most were parried or turned aside by the Nemesis Dread Knight's warded armor. Others smashed through arcane defenses and bit into silvered plate. One severed a hydraulic line, spilling oily fluid over the Dread Knight and demon Primarch alike. Another bit into a knee joint, shattering servo motors and leaving Voran limping. With a snarl, Angron brought his barbed tail sweeping around, knocking the Dread Knight from its feet and stamping down upon the prone warrior's harness with a cloven, brass-shod hoof. Ceramite splintered and collapsed, bones shattered, blood jetted forth. As Angron raised his weapons to land the killing blow on Voran's downed Dread Knight, Grandmaster Vorans drew upon his psychic might and charged forwards, Nemesis mace rimmed with azure fire. He crashed into Angron's flank in a dazzling explosion of force. The demon Primarch reeled, throwing back his head and letting out a bellow of apoplexy. Morven drove past Angron's bulk, parrying brutal blow after brutal blow, and positioning himself between the demon Primarch and his last surviving brothers. He felt a well of hatred bubbling up from the pits of his soul. Righteous hatred. A Spine Grinder, teeth now clotted with bloody gristle, slammed into his Dread Knight's force fields, which flickered and strained as they deflected the blow. Morven's hit back, swinging his warsuit's fist into the monster's ribs. A satisfying crack rang out as demonic flesh and armor broke under the force of his strike. He struck again, driving Angron back towards the portal. The ritual casting had reached its crescendo now. Morvens felt the gate's empiric magnetism tearing at his psyche. Angron, too, clearly felt its pull. The demon primarch's skin began to blister and peel from his body. The burning hatred in his eyes remained undimmed. Around the combatants, the Grey Knights had pulled back to surround the remaining paladins. Demons, cultists and world eaters continued to hurl themselves upon them. Other loyalist forces were interspersed amidst the unfolding fight, unable to make any significant headway against the teeming masses of heretics. Morven swung with his mace. Angron intercepted the blow with the crook of his chain axe and twisted, bending the Dread Knight's arm back and wrenching hard with a bellow of exertion. With a scream of shearing metal, the limb came free. Angron struck again. Samniaria slammed into the Dread Knight's frame and bit deep, its burning blade driving through the harness and into Morven's breast. He exhaled in pain as Angron wrenched at the daemon blade, attempting to free it from his innards. Waves of agony coursed through the Grand Master's body. With a final booming syllable, the paladins completed their ritual. The 8 slivers of the black blade were snatched up by the empiric vacuum of the dwindling rift and drawn into its mouth. Demons screeched as their physical forms were torn apart and cast back into the warp. Loyalist and heretic soldiers battling across the Crimson Mess's southern slopes clutched at their skulls, blood streaming from their eyes as the rift tore at their very souls. With Angron's weapon still lodged in his chest, Morvens drew upon his last reserves of strength. He pressed his Dread Knight's shoulder into Angron's chest and drove the snarling demon towards the gate's imploding core. Locked in a violent embrace, the two were dragged into the abyss, the last of Morven's lifeblood pouring from his body. Fleeting visions of Armageddon flashed through his mind. Aquila banners raised high, battles yet to be fought, champions risen, and heroes slain. As death rushed to meet him, he felt the empiric shockwave of the Red Angel's Gate collapsing into nothingness behind him. His duty was at an end, but Armageddon's suffering would continue.